Right, so for this video, we're going to be making a small personal website, and we're mostly going to be using just plain text. It's actually more of like a document-based website than like what you might expect for, it's not going to be super fancy. But plain text websites, especially for like a personal portfolio type of thing or like a business card style site, can be quite effective. It gets straight to the point. It's easier to read on mobile usually. It doesn't require a lot of fancy image work. So it's not a bad style to use, even if you can do more professional grade websites. So we're going to code this from scratch like we always do. And the first step is going to be to create our folder. So in this case, I'm going to be creating a website for myself, and I actually already have a domain name. I'm going to name it my domain name, so markjohnson.me. But if you don't have a domain or you don't know what to call it, that's fine. You can call this folder anything. The actual domain here doesn't really matter. I'm going to drag this down into my code editor like we do. And we're starting from scratch, so there's nothing in here yet. No HTML, no CSS. And the first thing we'll do, like we did last video, is create an index.html file. Index.html. And remember from the last video, this is a special name, index, that we use to indicate that this is our home page. So when someone goes to our website, the browser needs to know which page to pull up. It always looks for a file called index.html. HTML is just saying this is a website and tells our computer how to open it. All right, so there is our HTML page. Our first tag, if you remember, is HTML. Surprise. And then we have got a head section up above with a title. Oops, getting ahead of myself. And then we've got a body section where we actually put our content. So I'm just going to stub that out. Now, notice I am indenting these with tabs, so I can, do this or shift tab to go back. This is purely formatting, but it does matter. So if you're going to be updating this code, which you will as we progress, it's easier to read when you nest tags with an indent. So all of these head and body tags right here are under HTML, therefore I tab them over one. Now I'm going to add another tag under head, and so I'm going to tab that one over, title, and I'll just say Mark Johnson for now. We can probably update this later. If you remember, this is the text that will show up in the tab in the browser, but notice I indented this to indicate that it's under head. Now, technically speaking, you could put all these on one line in HTML like this, and everything would still work fine in the browser. The browser doesn't actually care about white space. It doesn't care about tabs, but I would not recommend doing that. This is for humans to read, the tabs, so that we can update it more easily later. So we're just getting set up still. I've got my title. Let's start with a simple heading. So this is a personal website. So let's start with a greeting, like, hi, I'm Mark. All right, and that's enough to start with. Let's go ahead and open this up in our browser. Just gonna go to my desktop, and we're going to go into our folder, and I'm gonna double click that file. And here it is in Chrome. Hi, I'm Mark. So that's the start of our very humble personal website. All right, so up next we need to add at least some basic styling to this. For instance, not a fan of this font, the serif style, so let's at least change that to a sans serif. To do that, I'm going to make a styles.css file right here in my code editor. And I'm just going to make a HTML rule right here at the top. So again, CSS is for styling tags, basically. So I've got my tags over in my HTML, and I've got my style rules over here in my CSS file. And I need to say, I want all fonts in this whole HTML page to be sans serif. So I'm going to save that. And again, nothing has changed yet. I can refresh, Command Tab to my browser, Command R to refresh. It's not sans serif. And that's because I have not linked that CSS file to my HTML yet. So that's the next step. And again, I'm going to use autocomplete like I did last video. Just type in the word link up here in my head section, hit tab, it fills in all the attributes for me. And the href part in particular, and this will come up again later in the context of a different tag, needs to point to the file I want to link to. So in this case, styles.css. Now if I had called that something else, like my styles, then you would just change it to link to that. So now that it is linked, I think we can Command Tab back to our browser, Command R to refresh, and sure enough, we've got a sans serif. So on a personal website like this, I can stretch this page out to be as wide as I want. And depending on how big your monitor screen is, that could look kind of dumb. And so a lot of times I'll recommend keeping a max content width and centering it. So this is new. We haven't done this before. This is getting into a little bit of layout. And I'm going to add a tag we haven't seen yet. So I'm going to add a tag in here right after body and call it main. That is the name of this tag. And then I'm going to indent this because this H1 because it's now under main. And so my main tag, I'm saying this is the primary content of my page. And you'll see why we're doing this in a second. But main doesn't do anything special, really. It's just a descriptive way of saying this is the primary content. And it gives me a tag name that I can write style rules for. And that's kind of the pragmatic reason we're doing that. So again, it does nothing by itself. You'll see nothing really changed there. But as soon as we add some styles to it, then we'll see the difference. So I'm going to make a style for main. And what we're going to do is we're going to say I want the maximum width, so max width, of this main section to be 800 pixels wide. And then I want to center that. So I'm going to do a little margin trick to center this, and I'll explain how this is working here in a minute. So I'm saying margin 0 auto. Let's just look at and see what that did. All right, so it did center it. Now you can't really tell that that's the case necessarily unless I add some border to this or something. So just to debug, this is something I like to do. I add a border, 1 pixels, solid style, and red. And you can see now that I've got a centered kind of red box here that I'm dealing with. Of course, we're not going to keep it that way, but this is a good demonstration that, oh, yes, indeed, we are centering some content here. So I'm going to turn that border off. I'm going to comment it out. Command slash. So these little slash asterisk things are actually commenting out that borderline. And so now it's gone, but it's still centered. So now we can start fleshing out our content a bit more without worrying too much about if it's going to wrap too far across the page or anything like that. All right, so I've got a nice greeting in here. I probably should say who Mark is, since this is a personal website. Let's make a paragraph tag for that. And I've actually got some text prepared for this, but you just want kind of like a tagline level definition of who you are as a designer or a developer or however you want to present yourself to your audience. So I've got this. This is kind of the same thing I use on my Twitter bio. I'm a web designer. What's that say? A web designer, developer and teacher, Chaos Explorer, launcher of site projects. Okay, so that's good enough to start with. And you can see now I've got a paragraph here. And again, we're not too worried about style at this point. We're mainly worried about communicating clearly, like who we are and what we can do. So speaking of what we can do, I would recommend at least starting with your top 3 projects. So if you have 3 projects that represent your design ability or your development ability well, and that's how you want to present yourself to the world, then those are the 3 things you might want to pick first. And since we are making a list of things, this is where we get to learn another tag, and it's a list tag. So we're going to start with an unordered list, which has the tag name UL. So it's an acronym for unordered list. And I'm going to close it. And then inside of the list tag goes list items, which conveniently are an acronym for list item, LI. And so there's the first list item, and I will just put the first one in. So I'm going to say my first primary project is my main gig, Pathwrite. So I pasted that in. And I'll add a link to this later, but we'll just take it one step at a time here. So let's look and see what this list gave us. So I do have a bulleted list here, but I didn't give it a heading. Actually, I should probably describe what I'm listing here. Maybe I should say something like select work. And so this will be a level 2 headline. So notice I'm using H1 up here. That just means this is the most important headline on the page. So hi, I'm Mark. That's kind of the introductory headline. H2 is saying this is a secondary headline. So it's not nested under anything really. It's just a way for the browser or the search engine to crawl this page and to know what the primary headlines are and the second headlines are. And note that while there's a 1 and a 2 here, this is the only tag sequence that has this kind of 1, 2, 3. And all it really means is headline level 1, headline level 2. It has nothing to do with the order you're putting it on the page. So this is kind of a funny common mistake I see HTML people learning HTML do. So they'll start numbering the tags by the order that they are on the page. That's not the point of that number. The point of the number is to say which one is primary. So I could have, in theory, I could have a secondary headline above this if I wanted to, that was an H2 or even an H3. And it doesn't really matter what order these tags are in. So the 1, the 2, the 3, that really just indicates the importance of the headline. All right, so I'm going to put an H2, let's say select work. And then let's Command Tab to our browser, Command R to refresh. That's a little bit better. I've got actually some structure here. And again, this is looking very much like a document at this point, and that's just fine. We'll add a little bit of styling later, but for now we're just mainly worried about the content. So if I'm saying, okay, Pathrate's my main gig, I co-founded it with my twin, I might want to link some of these things up. So let's link, first of all, let's link Pathrate to the actual Pathrate website. And how do we do that? How do we create a link? So I would say link is probably the most important tag on the internet because it's what it makes the whole internet work. The internet without links is not the internet. It's just a static page. So this is an important tag to learn, and it's A, which stands for anchor. And there's an href attribute. I'll talk about that more in a second. And then I'm going to wrap it around the word that I want to be the link. So in this case, I want Pathrate to be clickable, that text. So I wrap the A tag around that word. And actually, let's just do it without this href at first and see what happens. So I've got this in a link tag, and I'm going to refresh, and nothing. That's because my browser is like, you dummy. You made a link, you made an A tag wrapping this Pathrate thing, but you never said that where it should go. And so I'm just going to pretend you didn't do that and render it as plain text. That's kind of your browser's thinking process, assuming you made a mistake, because it doesn't make sense to have a link that doesn't go to anything. And so that's what this href attribute is for. And an attribute is something that goes inside the opening tag. So this is the opening tag. This is the closing tag, and the href, or the attributes, always go inside the opening. And in this case, we have an attribute called href, which points us to where we want this link to go. Now, does this attribute look familiar? If you look at the code so far, you can see it. We also have an href up here, which is doing the same thing. In this case, this is not a link that you can click, but it is linking the style sheet file, styles.css, to our page so that they are actually applied to the page. In this case, we're actually going to be linking to an external domain. So https www.pathrate.com. So put the full URL like you would put it in the browser. And then if we go to our page, we can see if I click that link, it indeed does go to pathrate.com. So now people, when they say, okay, my select work is Pathrate, they can click on that and explore farther. Now, I may also want to link other things in here. So I'm referencing my twin. I might want to link to his website. But we'll leave that for later. So, all right, so I've got my first piece of work in there. I'm going to go ahead and plug in the next two just quickly. And I'm going to do that with a little code trick. Notice I'm selecting li to li here, this whole block, and I'm going to hit Command-Shift-D, which will duplicate that code. So I don't have to write it all again. So I'm going to duplicate that code for another project I've got called Tilt Maps. And I'm just going to update the details here. tiltmaps.com, and then update the description. It helps if you have all this written out in advance. I highly recommend doing that. And then let's check out how that one looks. Tilt maps. Let's see if the link works. Yep. All right. And then finally, I've got one more. This same thing. Select it. Command-Shift-D. Saving myself some keystrokes. Let's add this one. Personality.com. And I'm going to add the description for that as well. Now, you could add more than 3 things. I recommend starting with at least 3 with like descriptions that kind of highlight why you did it and why it might be interesting for someone to click. And so I've got all those things in there now. And then finally, I would recommend at least having a section where you can link to yourself on other networks. So say your Twitter account or your Medium account or Instagram or something like that. So since that's also a list of links, just like this one is, I'm just going to start by copying this whole block of code. So again, you could either Command-C, Command-V it and copy-paste, or you could do that same trick, Command-Shift-D, and duplicate the whole code. And so I'll just call this section links. And I'll say, okay, so you can find me on Twitter. And I don't really need a description here, so I'm going to delete the text. And I'm going to do the twitter.com/wnewmark. And then let's add in And again, I'm just copying and pasting code here again. Let's add in Medium. And I think they use a different URL format. I think it's like at WMDmark. Medium. And you don't have to use the same headlines I'm using. Obviously, you can call this, like, you could say my projects or find me on or whatever. But just make sure it communicates clearly what the intention of these lists are. So here I've got basically some of the information you would need to know kind of who I am, what kind of stuff I've done, and where you can find out more. So that's not a bad start. So obviously this is not a very beautiful page to look at. We're not too worried about style again at this point, but let's add some basic styling in just to see if we can make it look a little bit better. So I'm going to open up the browser here on the side, and I'm going to drag my code window over so that I can see the code and the browser at the same time. This is a kind of nice handy trick, especially when you're styling, because it's just faster to be able to iterate this way. So let's go to my styles, and let's say we want to have a primary color for our links. Let's see. So let's do A. And let's say I want to pick green as my color. I can do A, color green, and then I'll refresh. You can see all of my links are green now. And let's say that when I hover over a link, we want to turn it blue. So that's kind of not super aesthetically pleasing, but just to show you how a hover works. And hover means you just roll your mouse over it. So I do this A colon, and this is a new thing. This is called a pseudo selector. And it basically says when I've rolled my mouse over that link, or it only really works on desktop since you don't really have a mouse on mobile, then it'll change the color to blue. So let's try that out. Yeah, you can see it's when I roll over, it's blue. So I think actually I want to keep the blue rollover, but not the green link. So I'm going to actually change the link to black just to blend in with the page. And now when I hover, you can see it turns blue. That's a little bit better, I think. I can also adjust the headline styles a bit. So I could say H1 font size. You could either use a very precise value here, like pixels, like I could say 22px. See what that looks like. It's a little bit smaller than the default. Or I can use proportional sizing, which I actually recommend. And I could say font size 2em. So that's 2 times the normal size of the default size of a font. And where is that default size set? Well, it could be up here. So like font size 14px. And if I refresh, then 2em is 2 times 14px, so it's 28 pixels. So if I wanted it to be a bit bigger than that, then I could do 3em. The nice thing about doing these em-based sizings is that if I say H2, let's do that 2em, then those all proportionally sized. Let's say that's looking a bit too big to me. I could knock that whole thing down and it'll adjust both proportionally. So both the H1 and the H2 are adjusted proportionally. So I do recommend doing it that way. So let's actually do 16px. Since this is a small page, let's go a little bit bigger on the font size. And then I'm going to tone these down a bit. So let's do 2.5 and maybe 1.5. Let's see what that looks like. And a lot of this you just want to play with until you get it right. And then actually one thing I didn't add to this page that you may want to, depending on what you're listing out on your page, is some sort of footer. You don't need to worry about this too much, but sometimes if you're listing work and you don't want people to steal, let's say, images or something, you might want to add a copyright. So copyright 2020, Mark Johnson. And now I've got a little bit of a footer there. Now here's a cool trick. You don't need to worry about like understanding all of this. This is going to be a little bit of JavaScript, just a tiny amount. And it's to update this date. So you'll find this on personal websites a lot, where someone will have a footer with a copyright, but it'll be like 5 years ago. And that's just like a very strong indicator that this person has not updated this site in a long time. And so you don't want to have to be on the hook for every year, remembering on January 1st to go and update the footer of your website. So we can do this dynamically. So we're going to add a script tag in here, right where the date should be, script. And what this does is it creates this little region in my HTML document that I can just write plain JavaScript in. So JavaScript is an actual programming language. It's not a markup language like HTML. It's not a styling language like CSS. It's an actual programming language. And I'm just going to use a very small part of it. So I'm going to say new date.get full year. And I think you could probably guess what that's going to do. it's actually not going to do anything yet. Nothing. So I got the full year here, but I didn't actually do anything. I need to actually write it to the page. So document.write. Document just means kind of the page I'm in. New date, get full year. Now I can see 2020, and now when January rolls around next year, I don't have to go back here and manually update that date. That date will always be up to date with the current year. So that's just like a small little trick. Yeah, you could of course just type that in manually. I just like to do the little JavaScript thing there just for fun. All right, so this is a very kind of document-centric, boring personal website. Stay tuned for our next video where we add some fancier styling to this, maybe even some images. But this is a good start.